low-income housing tax credits. And we'd seen how it sort of took off when you gave bonus points for coming in with passive. And so of course that was the first try in Massachusetts. But let's talk to the tax credit agencies. Let's see if we can do something similar. Fell flat on our face. Basically just very big skepticism that it would be a huge incremental cost, like 15%, 10%. And of course, their perspective is every increase in upfront costs means that many less units that they can build, right? So it's just, they weren't interested at all. And so we said, like, what can we do? Like, we're hearing from Pennsylvania and a lot of people in New York that it's really not that much more expensive, that it's definitely a different way of building. And the first time you do it, there's a huge learning curve, but is it really that much more expensive? We didn't think it would be 10%, no way. We thought it would be closer to 5%. And I'll show you here, but what we ended up doing is saying, like, let's give some money to affordable housing that's going in for low-income housing tax credits. Let's give them a nice, generous number, $4 grand per unit, to bump up their design to passive house and build it. And let's track really closely what changes. And so this was launched in 2017. We've funded 8 projects, 540 total units. And 5 of them by the end of the month will be occupied. 3 are under construction still. And so if you go back to the history, this is not one of our projects, but this is one of the reasons that we thought this is not going to be that expensive. This is a little smaller scale, but maybe it's a little more relevant to what you tend to see in Vermont. So Trinity, led by the architect Hank Keating, who is now the president of Passive House Mass, basically did a stealth passive house project in Taunton, which is, sort of central Mass. All electric buildings between 2 and 9 units, but like the picture is sort of representative, right? It's sort of more suburban or outside of the main urban areas. And Hank did an amazing thing, which is he pre-funded 5 years of monitoring, and New Ecology was paid upfront to do annual reporting on what the energy use was and the water, and they tweaked things as part of that as well. So actually, if you're ever looking for data, if somebody says all electric buildings are too expensive, this is a great place to look, because we have 5 years of monitoring reports that show exactly the opposite. Like, this is really inexpensive to run. And the same developer, I think it was 3 townhouses built like 3 years before, were done LEED. And so this chart that I'm showing you is comparing the heating energy, and this is just heating energy, right? But that's where passive does the best anyway. The townhomes to the 16 individual passive house stealth projects. So, like he modeled it right. He didn't tell the general contractor what he was doing. He didn't mention passive house. He just put the air exchanges in. He put the insulation in, right? He went to triple glazed windows, heat pumps, like stealth, right? So, and he did it in budget. It's basically the same dollar per square foot as their typical construction. And so, like, we already sort of had a hint this wouldn't be that expensive, but let's see, right? So then we go on to the projects that Mass CEC has funded. And these are 7 of the 8. Like I said, 5 of them are going to be at completion very, very soon. And what I have here are the incremental cost ranges that we see on these 7 projects. So it ranges from 1% to 4%, but it's averaging 2.2. So it's definitely more in the like 1 to 1.7, like they're clustered on the low end. There's one big outlier, and that is North Commons, which is a community builders project. And that one had applied, it was at 80% drawings when they got our grant, and they had applied twice for low-income housing tax credits and been rejected, and they added the scope on. And I think it's a perfect example of why it's more expensive there is the design. Look at that North Commons. Look at that roof line. And if you ever hear, I think they spoke at Passive House Mass's symposium last fall. It was a really interesting, detailed project, but like where the mechanicals are and this roof line made it a lot more complicated. Yes, Stephen Winters can make anything passive, right? But But I also like the diversity of looks and sizes of the approaches we ended up funding. So Harbor Village on the upper right is only 30 units, and it's right on Main Street in Gloucester, which is like a fishing town in Massachusetts. It's thin brick. Doesn't look so much from the picture, but it fits in really well with the Main Street. In fact, I went to the ribbon cutting, walked right past it. I didn't realize that was the building. It fits in so well. We have Hanson Village, which is like a really traditional suburban style 3-story affordable housing complex. And actually Dakota Partners has built almost the same thing in Connecticut twice. So they sort of have a pattern book, right, for how to do this. I've got to say their sliders almost didn't make it, but I think we're going to get there. And I think that some of that is because they got by with things in Connecticut where it's a little bit warmer than our climate. So you can't always just plop everything, you know, climate zone does matter, right? It definitely does. The biggest one is Mattapan Station. That one's really big. It's right on a T-stop, what used to be a parking lot for the MBTA. And then we have a bunch that look pretty modern, right? Like Cambridge Finch. That was the FIA's best affordable project last year. So nice diversity of looks and sizes that we've funded. And so like, I think it is instructive to look at like what changed, what was the big thing that changed. And so I think for like 4 or 5 of them, they had bid it out once before and they were at 80% drawings and they were just tweaking to get to Passive House. So it's very easy to track those incremental costs, right? It's mostly change orders for some of those. And then the ones that are later are a little more difficult because from the beginning they've designed for Passive House. And so you have to go back and say, what would I have done without this money, right? Which is always a little bit tricky. And I will say, Massachusetts stretch code is much higher than Vermont's, right? So these kinds of numbers might not hold in Vermont. But still saying that, you know, having incremental costs that average 2.2%, that's tiny in these big construction projects. I mean, I've heard several general contractors tell me that this is in contingency, like site conditions and like strange, you know, preferences that the architect has put in for the look of it are way more influential than this. And yes, costs are high right now. It's a really hard time to like hold the line on this kind of stuff. But by committing to Passive House up front, when you value engineer, you know, you can put landscaping on the operating or sacrifice on finishes and still get there at the same number with this kind of upscale. And I need to go back because we've gotten some new numbers, but I think almost always one of the 2 top tiers of costs has been around ventilation, much better ventilation. You know, our code requires 1 supply in each unit, but Passive House means you have to bring it to all the occupied spaces. And so that's often the biggest cost. And I've got to say, like, after COVID, isn't it an easy argument that we should be putting better ventilation in all these buildings? You know, it gives you a good argument for compartmentalization, which is also part of at least the FIAS side of things. Because, you know, I don't know, I've lived in multifamily buildings before and I can smell my neighbor cooking Indian, right? That means I'm getting their air, right? And compartmentalization is a really good argument in multifamily. I guess I would say there's a lot of side benefits of Passive House that aren't recognized. It's not really all about the operating carbon, and it's not all about getting the best envelope possible. I think there's a lot of other side benefits. And honestly, the reason in New York City that you'll see even private sector going towards Passive House is owners are finding turnover is much lower, right? People are happier, they're more comfortable, they can't smell their neighbor's stuff. It's triple glazed windows means it's quieter on the street in New York City, right? To the outside. There's a lot of these like little benefits that add up, I think. And if you guys have ever worked in an organization that does affordable housing, like turnover is a huge cost, right? Or certainly even for market rate. You have to repaint a lot of times. Sometimes you have to put new finishes in, like depends on how the tenant's been on the unit. But if you can reduce all this moving around, it really helps your bottom line a lot. So ventilation's the biggest one. Shading features occasionally in the thermal bridging kind of thing. Definitely there's higher costs associated with the construction verification, although it's way less than I thought. Like, so I've been very disciplined about asking questions about the line related to the passive house consultant or verifier. And people have a tendency not to net out what they would have done in the past, right? So usually you're going to hire a green building consultant of in some shape or form, and maybe a HERS rater too. Like those should be netted out, right, from that cost. And to me, the construction verification, this is the golden spot of passive house. So many buildings are not built the way they are designed. And if you don't have construction verification to this kind of level, you don't get what you design. And honestly, I also think durability is going to be a lot better because of that, and also because of having a third party, like, you know, looking at the design, even, you know, somebody checking to make sure it's a continuous air barrier, saying, oh, this looks like it might have a moisture problem if you build it this way, or like that kind of comment up front. Having more people looking at that means our buildings are going to last longer. I worked in affordable housing for like 12 years, and I can't tell you how often at refinance we thought we were going in for just baths and kitchens. And what do we find? Mold in the insulation and rotting sheathing, right? And that's not good enough. Building science went into building that, right? They started tightening things up before they really knew what they were doing. The one thing I will say is the window premium, which I always think of as the biggest, one of the bigger costs, wasn't the biggest cost in very many of them. And part of that's because the options, there's many more options coming online and they're less expensive. And even in a couple cases, so Mattapan Station in particular, they used an Alpine, which isn't a true triple glaze, right? It's like but it gives you the same effective kinds of impacts. They priced it once. They changed to passive house. The general contractor collected new bids from the subs. They all freaked out, right? This is really common if you change midstream, or even sometimes when you say passive house up front and people aren't that familiar with it. The uncertainty meant that I think the number went up $2 million. And so the passive house consultant had a meeting with the envelope subs and then the mechanical subs and talked through every detail that changed, and really gave a strong impression that the standard wasn't just going to get thrown over the fence at these folks. And so, and like on the ventilation side, like they just hadn't thought through a lot of it. And so they just added a lot of numbers to it. But when they talked through what's going to change, it was actually cheaper than what they were thinking before. And windows, so there was a passive house mass meeting where right before COVID, it is recorded if you're ever interested in looking. Delbrook is the general contractor, and they explained this whole dynamic, right, with the subs. And the subs, it came down after that educational process to a 2% premium, which is what it's still holding at right now, but we don't have final numbers yet. And at that webinar, they talked about the cost estimator for Delbrook was there. And he talked through, they played like a game with the audience, like higher or lower based on this detail, right? So the major categories that changed for going to passive house. And the one that surprised me most was the window one, which is they had an Alpine, but this kind of like window extender that was built into it, which I think is a pretty common thing to add to almost all triple glazed windows. And the detail that they had before with a double glazed high performance window fitting into the exterior continuous insulation was like a really fussy detail that required a lot of labor, a lot of wood. And so when they repriced, that came out as the same cost. And that was because even though the window is more expensive, the labor was actually less. So they priced it the same. And so now we get to the other half of the conversation that I sort of referred to at the beginning, which is that's only half of the discussion, right? saying something's not that much more expensive is only compelling if it gets you a lot, right? And so this is where we need to make the case more strongly. But I think it is encouraging because there's more communities that are putting out energy disclosure ordinances. And so there's reporting that's required for buildings of a certain size. So like Jane and Brendan from Department of Energy have pulled data from the energy disclosure ordinance in Boston and pulled that down, and lo and behold, the only passive house building, which many of you might be familiar with, which is the 28 unit distillery, it's in green on the left here, 20.8 for how much energy used per square foot. And we have a bunch of leads and codes as well. But on average, it's in the range, and we're still doing a little data analysis because there's definitely some junk in some of this data. We think especially some of the lower ones may be suspicious, but we're on the order of 63% less energy per square foot for the distillery than the median new multifamily in a similar, time frame. That's pretty dramatic, right? So from the modeling, I think you'd expect between 40 and 60%, but it's encouraging to see it's on the more efficient side. Philadelphia also has an energy disclosure ordinance, and Green Building United pulled this for us, which is just low-income housing tax credit projects. And again, lead and code, the medians are much higher. I think it's also really interesting to note the passive house all cluster around the same amount, which is very low, right? But look at the variability in the lead and the code, right? And I do know, I think at least one of the code ones actually was aiming for net zero. So that's almost not fair to include, right? Because, you can build a really good building without any standard. Absolutely. It's just the flip side doesn't always, lead isn't always going to give you a really efficient building envelope because it's only 30% of the points, right? And this one's more in your neck of the woods, but it's basically two almost identical buildings built, I think it was like 6 or 7 years apart, one lead and one passive, and 49% less energy. And so like, this is the most compelling kind of argument, right? Because it's the same owner, same management company. And just, we are lucky because New Hampshire Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Agency, they require reporting on the performance of projects, which we don't have in Massachusetts. I don't think they have in Pennsylvania either. I'm not sure if Vermont does or doesn't, but for ones that were post 2006, this is like a 3-year running average of the energy use per intensity. And again, 49% less energy than the median lead. It's not encouraging that the lead median is above the code, I've got to say. So we did this program in 2017. 9 months later, MassSave picked up a very similar program. So like, this is the ultimate in successes for our agency, right? We don't have the money to do things long-term, but MassSave spends $2 billion a year. So like, it's awesome when they pick up one of our good ideas. And it has a very similar structure to what we did. So I only mentioned the 4,000 per unit, but it's in 3 categories. So their program is not just for affordable housing, it's for market rate as well. And I love the way they designed it with these pre-construction incentives. So they provide up to $5 grand per building, anything 5 units or above new construction. They provide up to $5,000 for a feasibility study. So like, this slides in really nicely with just a normal energy, green charrette that you might have on a building. It's like a deep dive on the energy piece, right? And sort of like, if we go for passive, what's going to have to change? And then they also provide 75% of the cost of passive house modeling up to $20,000. That's great to get, to me, I think we're going to see a lot, even if people don't go for passive house after doing that, they know a lot more about thermal bridging, and I guarantee the architect's going to look at air infiltration differently. And then they provide $3 grand per unit when you actually get certified. It's in 2 steps, one with pre-certification and one when you finally get certified. So huge market interest, huge, huge, huge. So obviously this is like in the range of what makes people stand up and listen. This has only been around 2 years, and 116 buildings have enrolled for those incentives. It's about 6,500 units total if they all certified passive house. And 70 of those buildings have completed passive house feasibility studies. And I think it's around 65 have done the modeling. So it's interesting, like some of them were past the feasibility study stage, so they couldn't get those funded. So it'll be really interesting to see who goes for the full certification and who doesn't. But I know I send people over to Mass Save, probably 2 a week. So, so there's still a lot of interest in this. And honestly, the straw proposal for code upgrades in Massachusetts came out last week, and there are fingerprints of passive house all over it. Like they don't actually, we want to be able to keep this incentive, so we're not requiring it. We're just making a very easy compliance path, or at least DOA is proposing that. And the education piece, super, super important. So if you guys are able to get ARPA money for passive house, you got to make sure that some of it goes into education as well. So they've been paying for half the costs of passive house, taking the passive house consultant, either version course and builder tradesperson. And so there's 107 that have actually gotten their reimbursement. We definitely see a lot of builders take the course, but not ever take the exam. I don't know what that says, but it's sort of interesting. And then there's been all of these lunch and learns and workshops, which by the way, Passive House Mass has a really good video library. Almost as good, not quite as good as Passive Accelerator, but it's very, very good. There's so much great content. So I definitely, and there's no reason you guys couldn't like play this for one of your meetings, like one of the best ones, right? Like you don't always have to create your own content. And so, like I said, our first round of trying to get the low-income housing tax credits to favor passive house like fell flat on its face. We were successful 2 years ago in getting like a 2-point differential on 20 total points between lead and passive house. And that maybe that pushed, I think the last time I checked, about 40% of the Mass Save ones were affordable housing. So it's a pretty big piece of that offering that are going for it. What I think is really exciting, and if any of you work with the QAP for low-income housing tax credits in Vermont, you should look at, they only have put out a draft, but I love it because it brings up the baseline on renovations in a big way, and it gives a lot more points. So 5 points for passive house versus other energy points. So when I said, so in Massachusetts, probably about 40% of our low-income housing tax credits goes towards preservation projects. So generally that is just baths and kitchens. But they're going to be requiring as mandatory requirements, enterprise green communities mandatory points, which means you're going to have to address some energy and ventilation when you do that upgrade. So this is huge, right? Like bringing up the baseline is one approach, and then rewarding the new with passive house. And I also think it's really interesting. We've been talking about embodied carbon forever with them, and they added 3 points related to reduced embodied carbon. I don't like the draft like checklist of things that you can get here, and hopefully they'll listen to the comments we gave them, but it's still encouraging to see it even mentioned. So that brings up the topic of embodied carbon. And I only mention this because it seems very clear to me that people who are interested in passive house are also extremely interested in embodied carbon of building materials. There's nobody more worried about it, it seems like to me, than passive house professionals. And you know what I always get when I start talking about embodied carbon of building materials with people in the world, and especially with policymakers, is they're like, something more, you've got to be kidding me. You've got to be kidding me. But I think all you guys know the difference between operational carbon and embodied carbon. And this is right off of Architecture 2030's website. We have so much that's encouraging us to have more energy efficient buildings and code upgrades that are helping on the embodied carbon side of things. So like a building built 10 years ago in Massachusetts, probably 75% over 60 years of the carbon related to it was related to operational carbon, and only like, 25% related to embodied carbon. But now that we've inched closer and closer and closer and are building better and better new buildings in terms of high performance, over 60 years, embodied carbon is often equal to 60 years worth of operational. And let's be clear, like in Massachusetts, our goal is to get to net zero by 2050. So we have a lot, we have like less than 30 years, right? So you shouldn't be thinking on a 60-year time frame. So this becomes even more, some people will argue that embodied carbon is more important than the operational carbon. And this is, I think, a good illustration of that, right? The upfront embodied carbon is all in that year one, like all that brick and cement and steel and all the things that go into bigger buildings in particular, all happens up front. And even if you look at the difference between the operational over 30 years of a high performance building and a regular building, you're talking at least 15-year payback on that, maybe 20 in a lot of cases. And the thing is that upfront can be way lower. And in some cases, in Europe, they're building things that are actually buildings that are new that sequester carbon. So that's sort of encouraging. And just like with passive house, how you have to think early, right, to make big impacts at low cost. I think there's sort of three pieces of the design process to building that you can hit real hard on embodied carbon. And one is whole building design concepts. So the city of Newton, for example, on a special permit project, senior living facility, asked them to do an embodied carbon study, and the architect sort of embraced the idea because they wanted to learn. And they changed the parking structure setup so that there were two entrances. Because of the grade, they thought they would need two entrances, but they changed the design and basically reduced the amount of concrete by 40% just in making one change on the design. The other is, of course, we need to use existing buildings as much as we can, even if you just have to use the structure of the existing building. It's a huge win on bigger buildings. And then once you get to material choices, there's a lot of options, and they really do vary huge. So like new construction projects, New Ecology has a really wonderful, they looked at a project that they built in Newton that had 4 or maybe it was 5 different cladding types for interest, right? This was designed to have a lot of architectural interest. And they looked at the wall section of each of them, because it's not just like the thing you put on, it's not just the thin brick or the, what you put on the outside that matters. It's like the whole wall assembly, right? Because sometimes it changes what you need for the whole wall assembly. I think the difference between the high and the low was 45%. And those are things that people are using right now, right? So there are real big changes you can make in material substitution for choices you make on what you clad, what you insulate with. And I think most of us know XPS is probably off the charts bad. I will put in your neighbors north in Maine just have Glavel, which is glass that otherwise would be thrown into a landfill. And it's a product that's been used in Europe, and they use all renewable energy for it. So look at Glavel instead of XPS. In fact, it's really interesting. I know of a couple of our projects actually that are just starting construction have been having trouble because of supply chain problems getting XPS. And almost all of them are switching to Glavel actually, because the plant just opened up last week. Or last month, right? It was in January. Then there's also these specifications. So the big one is concrete, and it's fairly easy. So first of all, like things that, like if you're familiar with LEED, like for a generation, we were putting fly ash in concrete to reduce, nobody ever explained to me why, but it was something that was done and you got points explicitly for. At least in Boston, because Portland cement is so expensive, well, first of all, you can't get fly ash in New England anymore, right? We don't have coal plants, so we don't have that waste material. So nobody should be specifying fly ash or actually asking for it to be more expensive. But if you if you specify concrete in Boston right now, you're probably going to get a 15% replacement of the Portland with slag. So that's a steel production byproduct, which eventually we'll have trouble finding as well. But there's a lot of other great substitutions, and New York is requiring low embodied concrete for all public projects. And so it's really changing the market there. And I would say glass pozzolans in particular are doing very well. There's a company called Positive, but that's not the only glass related thing that you can add instead of Portland cement and get similar strength gain. Once you get up to like 40%, you might have how long it takes to get to full strength impact, but it's really easy to get 25%, 30, even 35% without really any noticeable difference. And so like the couple of places you'll find structural engineers get a little worried about is when you're going vertical fast. But usually that's like 20% of all the concrete they're going to use on the project, right? So anyway, so that's my, and this we were talking about Glavel. So wood fiberboard insulation for exterior continuous instead of EPS or XPS, I think is a really good solution. We're going to see a lot more people doing it. Unfortunately, right now, it's very hard to get because France passed a law like requiring low embodied carbon materials. And so Gutex, which is probably the product most of you know, you can't get it right now at a decent price because honestly, the next 5 plants in Europe are all going towards France. But we do have in Maine, Go Lab, their facility will open in 2023. So if you can wait that long, it's coming. It's a little different to work with, but I think in the long term, it's a really good product. And those are the big things. And of course, cellulose is like a total win. It's always been a total win on embodied carbon. So keep using cellulose as much as you possibly can. And I guess the other thing I would say is mineral wool is often thought of as better than your plastics. And some of those numbers are because the blowing agents were so awful like 4 or 5 years ago. They're a lot better now on the foam products, but it's not that much better on embodied carbon, honestly, if you look at the numbers. I still think it's good to use it when you can, but there's limitations. So anyway, I gave you guys way too much information all in one presentation, but I'm hoping we can have a nice Q&A now.
Yes, certainly. Whoever wants to, you can put your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask them.
Beverly, I had a question about XPS and using EPS as a substitution. We have a project here in Massachusetts, Holbrook Senior Housing, 72-unit passive house designed by the Narrowgate. And we originally we were intending to use XPS, and then obviously New Ecology caught it on the blowing agents, and we were able to switch to EPS by Shelter Foam out of New York, which had lots of products in the various PSI requirements that were needed, but we did need some confirmation from Shelter Foam on their blowing agent used, and it was successfully accepted by New Ecology. Do you?
Yeah, so is that exterior continuous or is that basement XPS? Like, I feel like a lot of people, there's not a lot of substitutes for subsurface XPS.
Yeah, it's high density. So we have, 60 PSI, 100 PSI, 40 PSI, and we're using it on exterior foundation and under slab.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Now that's a product we should make sure people know about. And Sean, I will say, like, Mass CC is bringing next month to our board an embodied carbon reduction challenge, which will have a bunch of prizes for projects that are, they shouldn't be like all the way built, but like if they're partway through and are making major changes, that's potentially something they should think about applying to, or some of your others that maybe are a little earlier and include all 3 stages, the design, the material substitution, and then the specifications. But that's a great example of changing the specification, right?
Beverly, I had a question. I think it was a pretty stark difference you showed on those graphs of passive house versus LEED Gold as far as energy use goes. And I noticed at the beginning you are LEED certified.
Yep.
From the title shot. Is there anything we can do in the LEED program itself? Because that's something that people, they know LEED, they refer to it right off the bat. And there's that still stark difference between what LEED can do or what you were showing as far as performance. Is there anything we could do with the LEED program to help get it closer to passive house levels?
Yeah, so they don't have any construction verification, right, in the LEED program, really. That's one of the biggest issues. And then LEED new construction, it's only 30% of the points that are at all related to energy. And thus you see, like, especially in urban areas, you know, I love the sustainable sites idea, but honestly, site decisions are very rarely driven by LEED. A developer finds a good site. It's location, 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 right? It's an opportunity. They've got that site, then they have to work within those parameters. Almost all the site points I feel like are gimmies, especially in an urban area, right? Transportation access, infrastructure, brownfield, you know, so all the stuff that ideally you'd want people to cite where they're going to put developments by that, but I don't think it changes anything. So like, I personally would get rid of all of those, and they would never want me to say that, right? And I do think water is really important, and I do think other things are important, but given that climate is such a crisis, I don't know if they can evolve. I wish they could. There are also like a lot of people vested in each piece of it, like the night lighting points, right? Or they've used the like big umbrella concepts to pull everyone in, give everybody a little something. And it means they're not really very good at the envelope part of it. So yes, and I know at least on the modeling, they do recognize passive house. So if you certify passive house, you can get like the maximum energy points immediately. So at least they're, you know, for a while, it was like you had to do different energy modeling always. And that's silly, right? Like what a waste of money.
Time expensive, yeah.
So at least they've moved a little towards it. And I guess on embodied carbon right now, so PHI with their PHP last model has added that embodied carbon like ribbon. So there's a little consciousness around embodied carbon there. But like LEED's the only place that I see a credit that's at all relevant to embodied carbon in any of the standards right now, except Living Building Challenge, which I love, but like is just not, you know, if you think developers roll their eyes when you talk about passive house, if you talk about Living Building Challenge, oh my goodness.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah, I just know.
I
LEED
wish, like, and
something
I
people know
think,
about.
and I'm not anti-LEED. I think it's really a good thing to do both, but it's just not sufficient on its own with the climate crisis.
Right.
And I'd love to see them evolve, love. And I cut my teeth on LEED. Like I was not an energy person. Not even, I was a brownfields redevelopment person until 12 years ago. And I got my LEED AP and it started a whole new career for me. But so I think it's a great entry point, the LEED Green Associate in particular, for people to get their toes wet. But it's like memorizing categories of credits. It is not building science.
Yeah. It's tallying a lot of points from all different aspects of a building.
Right.
Yeah. All right, thank you.
I have another question from Jen Lane. Do you have any feedback on the XPS product that uses the alternative flowing agent?
I don't know it. And honestly, like, I'm not a builder. I'm not an architect. I'm not in the field. Don't ask me detailed questions. Like, I know just enough to be dangerous. I'm a policy person. I have a public policy degree.
The only thing I know is that the XPS is the highest embodied carbon of all the materials.
By a
And,
lot, like by
and-
3
and
times.
going to EPS, like the one that the Sean was talking about, it's a very good alternative.
And I will
Wait.
say in Massachusetts, there are some markets for reclaimed XPS from demo projects. So I think there's a Springfield, sort of looks dirty, but it doesn't, it's nobody's gonna ever see it, so it doesn't matter. Paul?
Yeah, I have another question here from Peter Hack. I'm curious if there was a large cost difference in the two identical Guilford, New Hampshire buildings built with LEED and passive standard. And do state incentives play into the affordability of building to passive house standards? It appears that you proved that even a 2% increase in construction costs pays off quickly. So why pay incentives? We need to convince people they are actually saving money. Bottom line, weep. So
Well,
understanding the large
yeah.
impact of saving fuel, carbon, but 90% of the population doesn't want to hear about it.
Yeah. I always, as a policy person, I always think early adopters should get a reward. And even that $3,000 per unit probably isn't paying for the whole percentage change. And it is totally true that the first time you do this, there's a huge learning curve, huge. So like, I don't mind paying people at the beginning to change the market. This $3,000 per unit that Mass Save has, it's been renewed for another 3 years. I don't know if it'll go past then. We'll have to see. Like maybe it won't be needed. Like the whole market would have changed and shifted. Or code gets so much better, like the straw proposal moves more towards passive house. And so like everybody has to do passive house. I definitely understand. And I wish people, well, and I guess it's a little complicated. So I don't know how bad it is in Vermont, but like in Massachusetts, the cost between electric and gas is one of the biggest in the nation. And so we do see, like with new construction, people going to heat pumps automatically, but in new construction, you still see a lot of combis and still with gas in them as well. And certainly when we start talking about retrofits in Massachusetts, if you try and electrify without improving the envelope to a great extent, and especially focusing on air infiltration, which our Mass Save program just ignores completely just about, you're gonna see a much higher heating bill if you switch over from gas. You will here. I don't know. I feel like Vermont has more oil, which is the economics are not nearly as tough with oil in Massachusetts. And honestly, in the new construction area, it's not that big of a deal. But so I don't like pitching the save operating costs because it's not always true.
I have another question. Is aside the incentives, are those points that the passive house is doing any effect on the success of applying passive house? Or
so I think it's having both an incentive and those extra points in your low-income housing tax credit ranking. I think it's very competitive. Low-income housing tax credits in Massachusetts, almost nobody gets them the first time they apply. So it's sort of a waiting game. Like, are you going to wait 2 years or 7 years? How long do you have to hold this property, right? So I do think some people make that calculated decision to up their points, but our QAP has 260 points in it. So how much does 5 points really change? And I will say, Massachusetts is not the most transparent about its scoring in its QAP. People like POA, who work in multiple states, say that Massachusetts is the least transparent. So you're not really sure how you scored on different things and why somebody got a project going before you. So if it was more transparent, I think it would make more impact. And I think that happened in Pennsylvania. By the way, Pennsylvania's 10 points got totally watered down the last round. I don't know if you know this, but they give almost the same number of bonus points for Zero Energy Ready, the DOE standard, which if you know that, that's like it's like Energy Star with a conduit for solar. It is not, it would be 50% lower or higher energy use per square foot if you did the minimum, right, than passive house. So some of the developers and architects were convinced passive house was the way to go and keep going, but the scoring is not driving that anymore. So I think you'll see the numbers fall off a lot.
So is it that data on performance that's driving the whole thing?
So they don't track performance. So like they don't.
No. But I mean the data on the passive house projects performance that's is driving.
Well, I've given this to Green Building United. I mean, I think part of what happened is there was a whole group of people who understood what passive house was, and Tim McDonald educated them all, and David Salomon, and all the people who are very active in Pennsylvania. They all retired, and it turned over, and nobody re-educated the new people. And somehow Department of Energy convinced them they should offer the same, almost the same points for theirs, even though it's very different. So it sort of undermines what was done before in some ways.
Good. Any other questions?
Yeah, Enrique, I had a question. That's okay. It's Craig.
Sure, go ahead.
Beverly, thanks for coming. Sorry I joined late, so I don't know if you touched on it, but I was wondering if you touched on aero barrier in your presentation, and if you're seeing aero barrier uptake, particularly on rehabs.
Yeah, so
in
I think aero
Massachusetts.
barrier has so much potential.
Yeah,
And like, I would love to see states who have like a mass save program design something at sale and new ownership that included aero barrier for everything, basically making it free, right? When aero barrier on a rehab is tough when there's a lot of stuff in the house, but when it's empty, you could do a lot, right? Like, and I think we need to, on the rehab side and like existing buildings, we need to think a little bit more about major decisions people make. So sale of the home is one of them, right? And buying a new home, because you usually get a contractor in there to do something, right? Maybe add on the energy scope at that time. Also like major, like say you're gonna finish out your attic to another floor, right? Or your basement, you're gonna finish something big, or add on like an office, right? That's very common right now since so many people are working from home. How can we make the whole energy scope work at the same time while a contractor's in? Like, I think we need to think more like that. And then we also need to think about, when's the roof going to be replaced? Who's residing? And how do we make the residing have continuous exterior added? How do we make that like every single residing job has what we want to see, or every window replacement gets what we want to see? Because we can't do deep energy retrofits on every single building when there's 2 million of them. We have to like take advantage of natural cycles of rehab.
yeah.
So,
And how about
I like aero barrier a lot. And aero, I will say like the 8 projects that we funded, almost all of them that had central ventilation or semi-central ventilation used AeroSeal in all cases. Which is
in the
product
ducting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think here in Vermont we're starting to get more uptake on aero barrier and its potential. I personally think it has a lot of potential to really help on a lot of different projects. Just one other quick question. How about, one thing, I just had a meeting the other day here with our historic preservation director in the state, and they're, I think, very happy. Honestly, all the historic preservationists that embodied carbon's back in the conversation more, because if you go back even 5 years ago, most energy efficiency people, Jacob Brack-Hewson here in Vermont is one of the key people to bring this to the national attention, I think. And anyways, it's an important and big issue now, but it really speaks to me to like the importance of interior storms as an example. If we're not going to be throwing windows in the landfill now and changing more of them, because like I said, we were always pushing for new windows. So do you have any uptake in Massachusetts on really people thinking creatively about how to make the thermal envelope better on rehabs with things like really tight interior storms? And are your architects really, I'm just curious what you think about your architectural space and when it comes to that and where people are at.
I think people are babies still in that topic, but I will say, if you're looking for a really good example of an existing building, like especially adaptive reuse. So I don't know how much of this you have in Massachusetts, Vermont, we have a ton of old mill buildings or firehouses or,
Yep.
you know, brick buildings. You're not going to want to tear that thing down. Like, so what do you do with it? But it's historic. So I will say, go to the Passive House Mass's website and look for the project that Heather Clark and Jacob were on. It's a Massachusetts firehouse in Fitchburg, and they put an addition on, but they renovated the firehouse that was existing, all with a focus on low embodied carbon. They got to Passive House, not Enerfit, not Revive, but like Passive House. It's under construction, so I guess I shouldn't say that, but Heather's discussion of the historic window, so she's paved the way with the National Historic Preservation people for triple glazed windows. It's tricky, and there's a limited number, but you should look, if you're doing any historic projects, you should look at that webinar. So Passive House Mass, Heather Clark was the speaker. I don't know if Jacob was on or not. I've seen like 3 versions of this, and I'm not sure which was Nessie and which one was the energy cohort list. It's confusing.
Yeah,
but that's
great.
a really good, it's a good.
Yeah. My question was more not like one-off projects, but like, I'm just curious what the vibe is
So
down there in
Windows, I don't
Massachusetts.
know. I
Like,
honestly
what
think
people are-
Windows, there are so many terrible windows,
I know.
especially if they were replacement windows. So like it might be a different discussion if it was like double hung, they're like really old windows, but like then you've got the pocket weights, and if it's not like, I don't know, I'm not sure. And I will say there's an innovative product that I like called, so it's an insert that goes into regular windows. Oh, Jane, maybe you know this, not Arrow
Shield.
Arrow Shield. So MIT, they took, do you guys remember Aerogel, which is like yeah. It's basically aerosoled aerogel that's clear. So you can't see it in the window, but it gives you the great insulation value, and it can be put in a double glazed window manufacturer to get triple glazed performance. So it's not on the market. They're doing all the testing with the major window manufacturers, but like, I think we're going to have trouble going to all triple glazed windows. Like new construction is one thing, but like all of our replacement windows and stuff, it's just too different for people. So the more we can find products like that can really boost the, and we just got to get people to go to casements is the other thing. Is like double hung windows should not, when you do double hung replacements, you should argue strongly for a casement window. People can understand that, like tilt and turn, that's too complicated for people, but I think casements, they understand and they've seen.
And anyway, the windows that we're using here in Vermont are not for Vermont. I mean, they may work even in Massachusetts or New York, but definitely not here in Vermont. I mean,
Well, look at the
our code is allowing for U 0.3 value in Windows, which is an R3 window, and we need here at least an R7 window. So,
and I feel like even the American manufacturers have made so much strides recently at very tiny incremental costs. Like, I don't know.
And it's not only the energy efficiency; it's all the condensation factors, the comfort factors. I mean, it's the same like what you were talking about before, making a retrofit. I mean, all energy retrofit in a non-envelope retrofitted building. You will never find comfort in there. So people end using alternative heating systems because the heat pumps are never going to give them comfort. So it's not a solution. I mean, you have to look into a totally integrated solution, which is the way the Passive House approach does it. I mean, you have to analyze the whole spectrum, not only, I mean, compartmentalize the solution. Yeah. Okay, we are getting to past the hour. Thank you very much, Beverly. It was wonderful, as usual, to hear you and all your presentations. And thank you very much for all of you. It was a great attendance. We're going to be sending you the link to the AIA credits that some of them you may want to claim, and also a link to the a recording of the presentation in case you want to review it again. And we'll be happy to entertain them with at Passive House Vermont any one of your questions here. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you,
Feel
Bill.
free, repurpose my slides.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.